Maya Henderson thought the old house at the edge of town was just a cheap rental. Daniel Reyes believed the strange mirrors inside were nothing more than relics of the past. But when the two strangers discovered their reflections were no longer their own, they realized too late that the house was not empty. It was waiting for them. I always believed fear came from what we could see. A shadow in the hallway, a figure lurking in the corner, a face glimpsed through a window pane when no one should be there. Those were the things that terrified me in childhood, the images that haunted my sleep. But I learned something different when I moved into the old house on the edge of town. Fear doesn't always come from what you can see. Sometimes it comes from what you can't. The house looked ordinary from the outside, though a little worn. Its white paint had faded into a dull gray. Its shutters sagged, and the garden was nothing more than weeds choking dry soil. The landlord told me no one had lived there for years. At the time, that felt like an opportunity, a bargain. The rent was cheap, and I wanted solitude. I thought the silence of an empty place might help me reset my life, clear my mind, but the silence I found was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The first time I stepped inside, the air was damp and cold, thick with the smell of wood that had been left to rot. The floorboards groaned beneath me with every step, and at first I dismissed it as the sound of an old house shifting after years of neglect. Houses do that, I told myself. They creak, they settle, they adjust to the weight of footsteps. But I noticed something strange after only a few hours there. The creaks seemed to follow me. When I walked into the kitchen, I heard a floorboard bend in the hallway behind me, as though someone had stepped where I had just been. When I moved upstairs, I felt a pressure at the back of my neck, so close it felt like breath. I would spin around, heart pounding, only to find the hallway empty. The house wanted me to believe it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the unease never left. What disturbed me most were the mirrors. There were too many of them. Almost every room had one nailed into the wall, as if the previous tenants had been obsessed with seeing their reflections. Some were tall and cracked, some small and cloudy with age, but all of them felt wrong. I noticed that whenever I moved in front of one, my reflection seemed slightly off, not completely, just a fraction delayed. If I raised my hand, my reflection's hand seemed to lift a second too late. If I turned my head, the face in the mirror lagged behind. At first I thought it was my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became that what looked back at me wasn't me at all. That first night I tried to sleep in the upstairs bedroom, the one with a large window overlooking the overgrown yard. The sheets smelled faintly of mildew, but exhaustion pressed me down, and I told myself everything would feel normal in the morning. Yet as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of breathing. It wasn't the steady rhythm of my own lungs. It was softer, uneven, like someone trying not to be heard. The sound was close, too close. It came from the space just behind my ear, a whisper of air brushing against my skin. My eyes shot open, and I turned sharply, but there was nothing, only the dark stretch of the room, faintly lit by moonlight filtering through the window. I sat up, heart hammering, straining to listen. The breathing had stopped. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, telling myself it was only in my head, that I was alone, that no one had breathed in that room but me. Slowly, carefully, I sank back down and forced my eyes shut. Sleep came in fits, shallow and restless. Then, the bed shifted. At first, I thought it was me rolling over, but I hadn't moved. The mattress pressed downward beside me, sinking as though something heavy had settled into the empty space. My chest locked tight and I didn't dare open my eyes. The air grew colder, heavy enough to make it difficult to breathe. I stayed frozen, trapped in my own body, knowing that whatever had joined me wasn't supposed to be there. When I finally gathered the courage to look, the room was empty. The impression on the mattress was still there, though, as though invisible weight still lingered. And that was how the first night in the house ended, with me lying rigid in bed, wide awake, staring into the darkness, while something unseen breathed just inches away. I tried to convince myself the first night had been nothing more than nerves and exhaustion. A new place, an unfamiliar house, and a mind eager to play tricks in the dark. That's what I told myself the following morning as I stumbled through the creaking hallways, pretending I hadn't heard the slow, steady breathing against my ear or felt the weight of something settling into bed beside me. I told myself stories, little lies, to keep functioning, but the house knew. It knew I had felt it, and it wasn't going to stop. By the second night, the strangeness became harder to explain away. I had checked all the locks before bed. I remember the sound of the key turning in the front door, the deadbolt snapping shut. Yet when I woke, the door was wide open. The morning air drifted in, carrying the smell of damp earth from the garden. I stood there, staring at it, heart hammering, wondering if someone had been inside while I slept, if someone was still inside. I searched the rooms, opening every door, peering into every corner. Nothing. The silence was thick, broken only by the groaning of wood, as if the house shifted with my movements, listening. That same day I noticed how cold certain places were. I would walk through the hallway and suddenly my skin would break out in goose flesh, the temperature dropping several degrees in a single step. The cold spots always seemed to hover near the mirrors, and I began to avoid them. though avoiding them was nearly impossible since they covered so many walls. Still, I forced myself not to stare into them too long. I didn't want to see if the reflection would lag again. I didn't want to notice anything unnatural. On the third night, sleep was impossible. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The house was restless. I could hear it shifting, sighing, stretching as though it were alive. Then came the sound I will never forget. Footsteps. They started above me, sharp and uneven, running back and forth across the attic. They weren't the hesitant creaks of wood settling. They were deliberate, heavy strides, pacing so violently that dust rained from the ceiling above my bed. I couldn't move at first. I lay frozen, listening as the footsteps circled faster and faster. I knew I was alone in the house. I had locked every door and every window. Still, someone or something was up there. Then the sound stopped. For a few long seconds there was nothing. My chest rose and fell too fast, and I prayed it was over. But then I heard it, the long, aching groan of the attic ladder unfolding by itself. The wooden steps extended downward with a slow scrape, until they touched the floor outside my bedroom door. I could hear it clearly in the silence of the night. My skin prickled with terror. Something had come down. I didn't dare move until daylight. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to investigate. My hands shook as I climbed the ladder, each step echoing too loudly in the stillness. The attic was dim, light leaking in from a small circular window. It was almost empty, just piles of broken furniture, torn boxes, and cobwebs stretching like veins across the ceiling, and a single wooden chair facing the window. The air was thick with dust, but what stopped me cold were the footprints. The attic floor was blanketed in dust, untouched for years, or at least it should have been. But scattered all around the chair were prints, bare feet pressed deep into the gray powder. They circled the chair again and again, countless loops, as though someone had walked in circles all night. I crouched closer, stomach tightening, and that's when I saw the worst part. The prints didn't end at the chair. They trailed out of the circle, across the floor, and straight toward the attic ladder. I followed them with my eyes, heart thudding. The trail didn't stop at the top of the ladder. It continued down, each print clear, descending the steps. And in the dust at the bottom, just outside my bedroom door, were more of them. The footprints led directly to where I had slept the night before. The room tilted around me, the air too thick to breathe. It wasn't just footsteps above me. It had come down. It had walked the same floor as I had, while I lay frozen in bed pretending I was safe. I stood there, staring at the prints, unable to shake the feeling that even now, in daylight, it was still moving somewhere in the house, leaving new ones behind. And when I looked back at the chair by the window, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The dust on the seat wasn't as thick as everywhere else. Someone had been sitting there recently, watching the house from above, watching me. I thought about leaving that morning. Everything in me screamed to get out of the house, to grab whatever I could carry, and walk until I found someone, anyone, who could take me far away from it. But when I tried, it felt as though the house itself resisted. My car keys, which I'd left on the kitchen counter the night before, were gone. I searched every drawer, lifted every cushion, even tore through my bags, but they had vanished completely. My phone, which I swore had been charging, was dead. I plugged it in again, and the screen flickered weakly before going black. No matter what I did, it refused to come back to life. Even the front door fought me. The lock jammed when I twisted it, the key refusing to turn, as though the metal itself had fused. I felt trapped, not by accident, but by something deliberate. The sense of being watched grew heavier with every hour. Even in daylight I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, following me from room to room. The mirrors made it worse. Whenever I passed one, I caught faint movements that didn't belong to me. A shoulder twitch, a blink that came too late, a smile that curled when my own face was expressionless. I tried to keep my eyes forward, but the weight of the glass pulled at me, daring me to look again. That night, I gave up on sleep. I sat upright in bed, back pressed to the wall, staring into the dark. The silence of the house was louder than any noise. My own heartbeat seemed to echo through the floorboards. Hours passed like that, and then it began. A soft scrape, the sound of something dragging against the wall outside my room. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound moved slowly, circling me. First along the far wall, then the side, then directly behind the headboard where I sat. It was deliberate, slow, and unbroken, as though invisible fingers traced the shape of my room. I couldn't move. The air pressed down heavy on my chest. The scraping grew louder, closer, until I thought I could feel it vibrating through the plaster. Then, silence. For a long, endless stretch, nothing happened. My muscles ached from sitting so rigidly, waiting, and the blanket shifted. I thought at first I had imagined it, but then it tightened. Slowly, carefully, as though unseen hands had taken hold of both edges. It pulled itself flat across me. My body was pinned, my arms locked at my sides, my chest compressed so tightly I could barely breathe. Panic surged, and I thrashed, but the pressure only grew heavier, crushing me against the mattress. I gasped for air, vision swimming, until at last, with terrifying suddenness, it let go. I sat up, drenched in sweat, chest heaving as though I had nearly drowned. My eyes darted across the room, desperate to see what had held me, but the room was empty, silent, innocent in the dim glow of the street light outside. That's when I saw it. The shadows on the wall didn't match. My bed cast a long, crooked shape, my body a hunched figure sitting upright. But there was something else. Another patch of darkness, darker than anything else in the room, twitching and shifting like it was alive. It didn't belong to any object, any source of light. It was a shape all on its own. My breath caught as the thing stretched upward, unfolding like black liquid spilling higher and higher. It spread along the wall, stretching toward the ceiling, limbs bending at impossible angles. It didn't move like a person, or even like an animal. It writhed, twisting, as though it had no bones, no fixed form. I pressed myself harder against the wall, staring in horror as it climbed. When it reached the ceiling, it froze for a moment, suspended there like a stain. Then, without warning, it surged across the plaster, crawling into the far corner where the wall and ceiling met. My eyes followed it, heart slamming painfully against my ribs, but in the next blink it was gone. The corner looked normal again, just ordinary shadows cast by the faint light outside. But I knew what I had seen. It hadn't just disappeared. It had gone somewhere else, slipped back into the cracks of the house. Waiting, watching. I lay awake until dawn, every nerve frayed, knowing that whatever had crawled across the ceiling wasn't finished with me. By the fourth night I had stopped pretending that what I was experiencing was just the product of nerves or an overactive imagination. I had accepted that something lived in the house with me, though I still couldn't understand what it wanted. All I knew was that it was patient, cruelly patient, and the longer I stayed, the deeper it seemed to burrow into me. Sleep was no longer possible. My body craved it, but the moment I closed my eyes, the house seemed to stir awake, filling the silence with whispers, creaks, and shifting shadows. I wandered through the rooms, pacing like a prisoner, listening to the strange heartbeat of the house. It was faint but always there, a pulsing rhythm that I could almost feel in the walls when I touched them. Sometimes I thought it was my own heart echoing back at me, but then it would skip, stutter, and continue at a pace that wasn't mine. The house breathed with me, but not in sync. It exhaled when I inhaled, as though mocking me, as though reminding me that it was alive in its own way. The mirrors had become unbearable. I tried to avoid them, but they covered nearly every wall. Even when I draped them with sheets, I would find the sheets torn down by morning, crumpled on the floor as though something inside the mirrors had ripped them away. I caught myself staring at my own reflection longer than I should, unable to look away. At first it was small things, my eyes blinking too slowly, my lips twitching faintly when I was perfectly still. But as the days passed, the differences grew clearer. My reflection lingered too long, almost as if it enjoyed being late, as though it wanted me to notice. One evening, I forced myself to test it. I stood in the hallway in front of the tallest mirror, the one nailed into the far wall. I raised my hand slowly, inch by inch, my heart hammering so loudly it filled my ears. For a moment, my reflection copied me exactly. But then it stopped. My hand kept rising, trembling in the air, while its hand froze halfway up. I stared at it in horror, willing it to catch up. Instead, it stared back at me with a smile that curled slowly across its lips, a smile that didn't belong to me. I stumbled backward, my body colliding with the opposite wall. The moment I broke eye contact, I felt something brushing my shoulder, a weightless, icy touch that burned into my skin despite being cold. I spun around, but of course there was nothing there. Nothing but the silence, pressing heavier with every second. That night, I didn't dare sleep in my bed. The memory of the mattress sinking beside me was still too fresh, too real, but exhaustion won. And eventually I curled up on the floor with a blanket, hoping the hard ground would at least make me feel less vulnerable. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, it almost worked, until I heard it again, the sound of the bed groaning as though something had settled into it. I froze, my eyes still shut tight, telling myself not to look. If I didn't look, maybe it would stay where it was, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly I lifted my head. The mattress was sunken, the imprint of a body pressed deep into the sheets. The blanket stretched across an invisible figure, pulled tight against a shape that wasn't there. My throat locked and I couldn't breathe. It lay there perfectly still, as though waiting for me to acknowledge it. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the knowledge that if I moved too suddenly, it might move too. I forced myself to crawl backward toward the door, inch by inch, keeping my eyes fixed on the bed. The imprint never shifted. It didn't vanish. It simply stayed, heavy and unnatural, as though mocking my terror. By the time I reached the hallway, my whole body was shaking, but leaving the room gave me no relief, because as I stood there in the dim light, I realized something more terrifying. The mirrors along the hallway walls didn't show me anymore. They showed the bed. Each one reflected the room I had just left, and in every reflection, the invisible figure lying in the mattress wasn't invisible. In the mirrors, it had form. In the mirrors, it was clear, and in every reflection, its head turned slowly toward me. By the fifth night, I no longer recognized myself. My body was weak from lack of sleep, my thoughts clouded by constant fear, and even the simplest details of reality felt fragile, unreliable. Every sound was a threat. Every shadow carried weight. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, only that the house was unraveling me piece by piece. It didn't need to touch me to destroy me, it only needed to wait. The mirrors had become impossible to escape. They seemed to multiply overnight. I knew there hadn't been one in the narrow stairwell, yet now a tall rectangle of glass reflected my movements as I crept up the steps. I knew there hadn't been one above the fireplace, yet there it was, showing me a living room that looked just slightly wrong. Its angles too sharp, its shadows too deep. I stopped covering them after realizing it didn't matter. No matter how many I hid under sheets or blankets, the fabric would always be ripped away by morning, as though the house rejected the idea of me not looking. I avoided them as best I could, but avoidance was impossible when the glass caught me at every turn. Sometimes my reflection was almost normal, and for a few seconds I could pretend, but then it would do something I hadn't done, tilt its head when mine was straight, blink when my eyes were wide open. Once, I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, and watched as my reflection leaned closer, pressing its palms against the other side of the glass. Its lips moved slowly, forming shapes I couldn't understand, as though it were trying to speak. I felt the shift inside me before I admitted it aloud. Whatever haunted the house was no longer just in the corners or in the walls. It was inside me, creeping beneath my skin, hollowing me out. My body didn't feel like my own anymore. My hands shook when I wasn't cold. My eyes looked dull and sunken, and sometimes I swore I could see movement in the edges of my vision, just behind the surface of my skin. That night, I made one final attempt to resist it. I gathered every sheet, every blanket, every scrap of fabric I could find, and I covered the mirrors. I pressed heavy furniture against them, stacking chairs and tables in front of the glass, barricading them like doors I didn't want opened. I convinced myself that if I couldn't see my reflection, if I cut it off completely, maybe it couldn't reach me anymore. Maybe I could survive one night without its presence tightening around me. But at midnight, I woke to the sound of fabric tearing. I opened my eyes to see the sheets sliding off the mirrors, ripped by invisible hands. Chairs toppled to the ground with deafening cracks. Tables splintered against the floor, until once again every mirror in the house stood exposed. Their surfaces gleamed faintly in the dark, reflecting not me but something else. I stumbled to the largest mirror, drawn forward by something I couldn't fight. My breath shook as I stood in front of it, staring. What looked back wasn't me. It wore my face, but the eyes were black and hollow, pits that swallowed all light. Its grin was wide, unnatural, stretching too far across the skin. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped in its gaze. Then, it moved first. My reflection raised its hand while mine hung limp at my side. It pressed its palm against the glass. The surface rippled like water, warping, distorting, as though the mirror was no longer solid. I felt the air around me shift, pulling me forward with an invisible current. My heart stopped as I realized what was happening. The barrier wasn't a barrier anymore. It wasn't trapped behind the glass. It was crossing over. I screamed without sound, pressing myself backward, but the air thickened behind me, holding me in place. My reflection grinned wider as its hand pushed further through, the glass bending around its arm like liquid. I could see the outline of its fingers reaching into my world. And then the lights in the house went out, plunging everything into darkness. For a moment, I thought it had gone, but in the blackness I felt a presence standing directly behind me. The faintest warmth of breath brushed against the back of my neck. My chest seized and I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. When the lights flickered back, the mirror in front of me was empty. No reflection. Nothing at all. Just a blank sheet of glass. I lifted my trembling hand slowly and saw nothing return the gesture. I was gone from the glass entirely. That's when I understood I wasn't the one looking into the mirror anymore. I was the one trapped inside it. And something else, something unseen, was wearing my face on the outside.